All right, so today I want to talk about TIPS bonds. TIPS stands for Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. And, the crux of the argument I'm going to make here is probably most relevant to those people that are living on a fixed income, like retirees. But just understanding what these types of bonds are, in particular, how they compare to what are known as nominal bonds or just regular bonds is an important distinction, and I think people could benefit from understanding it. So let's just start with an example using two different bonds. First, you have a nominal bond, and I want to talk about the components that determine the yield. So you may hear in the media that you can go get a bond for, say, 5% in yield, or much higher yields than we used to get for the last decade or so. Well, how is that yield determined? Well, just think logically. If you are going to lend somebody money, you might have certain questions that you want to ask to determine, what kind of risk you're taking on. And generally speaking, this is divided into three different categories of things that we want to think about. First is credit risk. Is the person that is asking you to borrow money, are they a credit-worthy borrower? Are you worried that they're not going to pay you back, or are you pretty certain they are going to pay you back? And so you have to decide, what kind of interest rate do I want to charge based on the credit worthiness? Next, term risk. How long does this person want to borrow money? Do they want to borrow it for a day, a month, a year, 10 years, 30 years? That is the term. For how long do they want to borrow this money? And generally speaking, just intuitively, the longer somebody wants to borrow money, you'll likely charge a higher interest rate for the longer term that they want to buy. That's not always the case, and we're living through an unusual period of time right now, but for all intents and purposes, typically, the longer someone wants to borrow money, just intuitively, you're taking on more risk to give them a longer time frame, and so you might demand more in interest return. Finally, what often gets overlooked or misunderstood is that there is also inflation risk built in. So if you are going to lend somebody money for the next 10 years, let's say, one of the things that you're going to consider is, well, how much inflation might there be over the next 10 years? Because I need to be compensated for that. So these are the three components that comprise the yield of a typical regular nominal bond. So we might have an example where we say, okay, this person's credit risk, I'm going to charge them 2% in yield or an interest because of their credit worthiness. And the length of time that they want to borrow money, I'm going to charge them 2% for that. And then I believe that over the term of this period, let's say it's a 5-year period, I believe that inflation is going to run at 2% per year over this 5-year period. And so I'm going to add a premium, or I'm going to add some extra yield that I'm going to require for the risk of inflation. And that is how we get to the yield of the bond. We add the 2% credit, the 2% term, the 2% inflation risk, and we'd say, sure, I'll lend you money for 5 years at 6% interest. And this is how we get there. Now, obviously, there's a lot of math and modeling and that goes into all this, but for our purposes, let's just take this as being the case. Okay, so those are the components of how a bond yield is determined. That's sort of the logical rationale for how we get there. And the question I want to pose to you is, what if we get inflation wrong? What if inflation comes in higher or lower than what we expected? That can present a real problem. And so enter the TIPS bond, which again, TIPS is Treasury, United States Treasury, issued. So the United States Treasury is issuing the bond. Treasury inflation, not issued. Treasury Inflation Protected Security. So the Treasury is issuing bonds that are designed to protect you from inflation. And you say, well, aren't we being protected from inflation over there? Well, we're using our best judgment to guess what inflation is going to be. But if inflation comes in higher, we're not really protected, are we? So we still have the same components here of the bond yield. There's the credit risk, the term risk, and the inflation risk. But what happens in this case is you could say, okay, for the same term, let's say 5 years, we assign a 2% credit risk, a 2% term risk, but we don't know where inflation is gonna land over this time period. And therefore, we can't say for sure what our final yield is going to be. And that may be a bit disconcerting because you say, well, geez, I'm not sure what I'm going to get out of this if we don't know what inflation is yet. I know these two variables, but I don't know this one, and I don't really know how it's all going to shake out. But the answer is a TIPS bond adjusts for actual inflation. Whatever actual inflation comes in gets input here into this area, and you get that return. So let's go through and talk about why this matters. So the reason this matters is that if inflation comes in higher than was expected, the TIPS bond is going to win, at least relative to the nominal or the regular bond that was over here on the left. If inflation comes in lower than expected, the TIPS bond will lose, but I'm putting these in quotes on purpose because what we're doing is we're comparing the TIPS versus the nominal bond, but what I'm going to encourage you to think about is just comparing the return that you get from either one of these to the return you need to keep pace with inflation. And so that poses the question, what is the bigger risk for a retiree? Is it a bigger risk for you to have a lower return, but it keeps pace with inflation? Or is it a bigger risk for you to have a lower return that does not keep pace with inflation? I'm going to make the argument that the bigger risk is that you have a lower return that does not keep pace with inflation. So let's look at an example. All right, so in our example, we have our original three components of the bond yield over here on the left. Note that I've changed the credit risk to zero because a TIPS bond is issued by the United States Treasury, which is deemed to be backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government and should imply zero credit risk at all. So it makes our math a little bit easier. The credit risk component of a nominal Treasury bond, just a regular government bond, should be zero for all intents and purposes. We're going to count it as zero. And we're going to say that this is a 5-year bond that gets 2% in term premium for the yield, and we're going to bake in 2% inflation for the yield. Over on the right, once again, these are Treasury issued securities, so there's zero credit risk, and it's the same 2% term premium. But of course, what's missing on top of here is inflation because we don't know where that's going to come in. So let's look at the math. You add 0 plus 2 plus 2, you get a 4% nominal interest rate on this government bond. Again, it's a government bond, therefore there's zero credit risk, so we have a 4% nominal return. Over here, we have 0% credit, but then we get our same 2% term in both cases. And the question is, what are we going to add here for inflation? So let's look at a scenario where we have lower than expected inflation. Remember, this represents our expectations for inflation. Well, what happens if we only get 1%? You get a little tiny yellow box here for actual inflation coming in at 1%. Well, you would have done better over here in the nominal bond. You would have received a 4% total return, nominal. Over here, you're only getting a 3% nominal total return. Well, you're going to look at that and you're going to say, well, I sure would have preferred to get the 4%. That's a better overall return. And that is true. But what is really important to understand about this scenario is that even this lower 3% return has at least kept up with inflation. And that's a really critical thing here. Yes, it is lower, but for those people that are living on a fixed income and inflation is, if not the biggest risk, one of the biggest risks to their overall lifestyle and portfolio, then I'm going to make the argument that accepting this lower return in this scenario is still okay because we know we've kept pace with inflation. Because the nightmare scenario is the other way around. What if the actual inflation is higher than what was expected? right? Here you're locked into that 2% expected inflation. Over here you got real inflation. Where did inflation actually come in? And now you're getting a 5% total return. So yes, it's a higher return, and that's nice, but most importantly, once again, it has kept pace with inflation. And the nightmare scenario for a retiree is an ongoing period of time where inflation expectations are lower than what is actually realized. And so your fixed income portfolio, your portfolio of bonds that are meant to be driving your cash flows for your spending needs in retirement, is not keeping pace with inflation. I'm going to make the argument that that is the biggest risk. This has not kept pace with inflation. Not keeping pace with inflation is a bigger risk to retirees that are on fixed incomes. So there's not a scenario in which TIPS are going to win every time against the nominal bonds. It depends on what happens with inflation. But at least with TIPS, you know that you're going to keep pace with inflation, however, whatever rate that it comes in. All right, so in summary, inflation is a major risk to retirees who are living on fixed income. Because if you have the same dollar amount coming into your household via like retirement income, whether it's from bonds or your bank account or Social Security, whatever it may be, inflation is a major risk. And that's what, I brought up Social Security. One of the major benefits of Social Security is that it's indexed for inflation. And so it should keep up with inflation over time. Second, TIPS can win or they can lose when we compare them to nominal or regular bonds. But the most important thing to remember is that they keep pace with inflation regardless. So even if they don't keep up with the return of a nominal bond because inflation comes in lower than what was expected, they are still keeping up with inflation nonetheless. And I believe that is a better risk to take than the risk of buying the nominal bond and having inflation come in hot and not keep up with inflation. And then finally, I put it on the summary page, but you haven't actually seen this yet. TIPS yields are as high as they've been in a long time. So part of the reason I'm making this video now is because it's my belief that TIPS bonds are very attractive for those retirees who are on fixed incomes and have some visibility into their spending needs on a go-forward basis. It may be an appropriate time for us to go ahead and invest in these Treasury Inflation Protected bonds so that we can build in an inflation protected income stream, at least for the next 3 to 5 years or so. You may have noticed that I put an asterisk right here because I said they keep pace with inflation regardless. It's important to know that inflation is based on CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and that may vary in its relevance to you or the retiree and how they live. CPI uses a basket of goods, services that are determined by the government when they want to collect the data. And you may spend your money on other things that are not included in CPI. And so it may feel to you sometimes like the real life inflation you experience at the grocery store or the gas pump or just in your living arrangements may feel different than the CPI number that's reported here. But in general, it is designed to measure broad-based inflation, and it should be a relatively good proxy for you. But it's not 100% lined up with what everybody spends. Let's take a minute now. I'm going to skip over to a web page and just talk about TIPS yields right now, where they are, and just give you some frame of reference where they are now versus where they've been in the past. Okay, so what you're seeing right now is a chart showing the yield on 5-year maturity TIPS, essentially. And as of the latest data, October 5th, I can get all the way to October 11th. We're at about 2.39% yield, and then you would add inflation on top of that. So wherever inflation comes in. So if inflation came in at 2%, then the total return of the TIPS bond at that point would be 4.39%. This is just the yield of the TIPS bond before inflation has been added. And you can visually see, we're looking at a 10-year chart going back to October of 2013. You can visually see that yields on TIPS bonds are higher than they've been certainly for the last decade. And even when I go out as far as the chart will go, here we are again, in the 2.39% range. I mean, we really haven't been to that range since the financial crisis in 2008. And prior to that crisis, we didn't get much higher than that, going back as far as the chart will go, which is 2003. TIPS were introduced in the late 90s, so I'm not quite sure why the yield doesn't go back that far. It may just be that they didn't start issuing 5-year maturity TIPS until later. I'm not totally sure. But the point is, we haven't had TIPS yields, starting yields, before inflation is added on top of them. We haven't had them this high in quite a long time. And so it feels like it may be a good time to go ahead and lock in this relatively high base rate. This is your base rate prior to adding inflation on top of it. It makes a lot more sense to lock in this yield at, say, 2.5% or 2.39, I think is the latest metric we have, as compared to, say, a few years ago, the base rate was negative. You can see down here we're getting close to negative 2% in TIPS yields, or what would be considered real returns. So just to break even, you would need inflation to come in around 2% or so to get you up here. So this is why I think that this is a timely thing to be looking at, is because the base rate that we're starting at is already in the 2% range, at least as of October 11th. And that is quite an attractive starting yield before you even add inflation on top of it. So that wraps it up. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope it was helpful. Thanks.